Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are doing a novel episode, which we are always excited about.
Today we are covering They Came to Baghdad. Christie, mid-career thriller, and a globe-trotting one at that. We have not been in this zone of Christie since our beloved The Man in the Brown Suit. Catherine, could you tell us a little bit about the publication history of They Came to Baghdad?
Yes, it was published on March 5th, 1951 by Collins Crime in the UK, published in the US later the same year, but it was actually first published in an abridged form in an 8-part serial in John Bull in the UK from January to March of 1951.
Okay, I am going to talk about our victims because we have two. The first is Henry Fakir Carmichael, who is an Englishman born in Iraq, fluent in all of the languages of the region, and a well-liked traveler by all. And he is killed by a knife to the heart in Baghdad. And this would, of course, be our character, who is very much based on Lawrence of Arabia. More on him later.
Then we have Sir Robert Crofton, who is, speaking of extremely famous English adventurers, he is one. He also wrote a book, and he has traveled to the far reaches of the world, including the interior of China and the Himalayas. He's been to Tibet. He's found dead in the water in Cairo, but it turns out he was not drowned. He, too, had been stabbed.
All right, so we are not really going to talk about suspects because even though we do have two victims in the story, there are two men who die. This is not a puzzle mystery whatsoever. This is, as we mentioned, a thriller adventure, globe-trotting at that. And if we are looking for clues and a list of suspects as we normally find them in Christie, we would be looking for a long time because they don't really exist in this story.
We actually are never going to find out who specifically killed either of our victims.
Yeah, which should tell you something. So as this is a thriller, we are going to be summarizing it in a much more straightforward fashion. So we are going to skip right ahead over our usual list of suspects, since there aren't any, and just talk about the world as it appears to be.
Anna Scheel is an American secretary to the head of a major international oil company, very well trusted, and she is both extremely competent and she's brilliant. She never takes time off, but all of a sudden she requests 3 weeks vacation in order to tend to her sister in London, who's undergoing surgery. So she goes with her sister to hospital, and then she disappears. And also, we find out simultaneously she's being followed around London by unnamed men and women who also have searched her room.
Meanwhile, in Iraq, a man named Captain Crosby and another man named Mr. Dakin discuss the possibility of the dangers in Iraq ahead of a major international conference between the West and the USSR. The president of the United States will be there, as well as good old Uncle Joe, Stalin himself. They will be attending in person, and Mr. Dakin is said to be a sort of washed-up oil company bureaucrat. He maybe drinks too much. He just hasn't amounted to much. That is at least the mask that he seems to wear. If there is more to Mr. Dakin, we will perhaps find out about it later on in the story.
So also in Iraq is a 35-year-old academic named Richard Baker, who witnesses a bizarre series of events in Basrah at the embassy, where a man dressed in Arab garb is shot at by a seemingly heavy-set business traveler who eventually says, oh, it's just a pot shot. He annoyed me, something like that, because Baker actually intervenes in the shooting. And we find out he intervenes in large part because he seems to recognize the Arab man, who is perhaps not an Arab, who in fact is sending Richard Baker a message via Morse code tapped out on beads. And then when he's leaving, he runs into Baker as he's running out. And Baker realizes that a paper chit, so essentially like a reference given to a worker, has been dropped into his pocket. And given the bizarre circumstances, Baker, he makes a duplicate chit. And he hides the original in case it's important. And then he puts the fake one in his pocket, which is subsequently stolen.
Right. It's interesting to note that the way that he secretes that shit is by rolling it up in plasticine. And we saw that in The Pearl of Price, Parker Pine short story. It was how the titular pearl earring was concealed in a bit of plasticine. So obviously we're in the Middle East and there is a lot of archaeological hijinks going on here. So there will be some resonances with previous Christie stories, but not a whole lot because this story really is a bit of an outlier. And now we're going to go to a different locale. And if this is all seeming a little confusing and discombobulating, that I would argue is the reading experience as well, or the beginning of They Came to Baghdad. Meanwhile, at the same time in London, Victoria Jones, pert heroine thriller alert. She's a, quote, amiable nitwit who is fired from her umpteenth typist job for being incompetent and also mimicking the boss's wife. She goes to eat lunch by herself in the park where a very handsome young man named Edward, no last name, just Edward, sits down next to her and flirts with her until she is just completely gaga for him, just head over heels. And he takes her picture, which she doesn't find creepy for some reason.
I mean, I immediately was like, well, that's creepy.
She thinks it's charming, I suppose, because he's so taken with her. He says, it doesn't really matter, like nothing bad could come of it because I'm going to Baghdad. He notes that he's going to Baghdad for work the next day, and this is sort of a ships passing in the night situation. And he does allude to things being very weird in Baghdad also, to something kind of strange and nefarious going on. And, Victoria is just generally taken with Edward and the idea of going to Baghdad to find Edward. She's essentially trying to pull a Felicity here and, follow her love. She doesn't have a job, so maybe she can figure out a way to get to Baghdad. And there really isn't an obvious way. But hey, presto, the next day, her temp agency has found a miraculous way for her to get passage there as a companion to a Mrs. Clipp who just broke her arm. And Victoria agrees. She's thrilled. And she heads off to Baghdad on a plane with Mrs. Clipp that also includes the famous explorer, Sir Robert Crofton, who is a bit of a pompous ass, it would seem. And Victoria notes with some glee on the airplane that, he's got a big boil on the back of his neck, so he isn't so perfect. At this point, I think that we're supposed to have fallen in love with Victoria as a character, but I'm gonna be honest with you, did not happen for me at this point or at any point in the book.
Yeah, she's supposed to be plucky, except she's repeatedly described as dumb and lazy. Anyway, in Baghdad, she ends up staying at the Tia Hotel with Mrs. Cliff, which is like a posh hotel. And she is hugely spoiled by the proprietor because she's a young, pretty English girl and he likes that. And so she's eating like elaborate meals and getting all sorts of free liquor, etc. And she stays on even after Mrs. Cliff leaves, even though technically she has no money and is running up a giant bill. And on top of this, she's lied about her background, saying that her uncle is the famous archaeologist Dr. John Ponsfoot Jones, and her other uncle is a colonial bishop. He only becomes a colonial bishop when another Englishwoman, Mrs. Carter Trench, a gossipy middle-aged lady, is like, well, that bishop does not exist. She has to make up the fact that he's in the Pacific archipelago. Unfortunately, Dr. Ponsfoot Jones is in fact in Iraq, but at a distant dig site.
So one night there is some commotion in the hall, and a man in a red scarf runs into Victoria's hotel room. He begs her to hide him, and she does. She shields him from whoever is after him in her bed, actually, only to realize that he's been stabbed, and he dies in her bed very dramatically. In the process of trying to help him as he's dying, she takes his scarf, and while this is all going on, Mr. Dakin, who we saw before, so the pieces are at least coming together at this point.
About 130 pages into the book. We're literally halfway through the book.
Mr. Dakin rushes in and he helps her cover the body, and the body turns out to be Mr. Carmichael, this man, Henry Carmichael, who goes also by Fakir. He is this Englishman who is beloved among the Arabs and presents as an Arab as well, depending. And again, this is very much based on the real life Lawrence of Arabia, who many of us are familiar with.
But what happens before he dies, Kemper?
Well, because we are in an Agatha Christie thriller, remember, before he dies, he does, of course, have to utter a few final cryptic words. Those words being, Lucifer, Basrah, Lafarge. What do they mean? We don't know. That, more than anything, if we're going to point to a mystery within this book is the central mystery of the book. What do those words mean? What's going on? That's what we're trying to solve here.
Given Victoria's involvement, Mr. Dakin tells her to stay awake while he disposes of the body, and that he will come back and he'll explain everything. And so he loops her into the fact that there is a giant criminal conspiracy, a global conspiracy, and that perhaps Victoria, who is obviously a talented liar, might help them. So he gets her to agree to go to Basrah, where, oh my gosh, her beloved Edward is also staying while he's handling customs issues for his employer, Dr. Rathbone, who runs a foreign cultural exchange program called the Olive Branch, which essentially translates the greatest hits of English literature into like 40 other languages, and then he goes around the globe to do these sort of cultural exchanges. Edward originally says that he thinks there's something shady going on there, and Mr. Dakin also is like, the Olive Branch. Yeah, something shady does seem to be going on there. This is interesting. This Edward fellow. Maybe, you'll get to see him in Basrah. Edward is surprised but delighted to see Victoria, and they become immediately romantically involved, so much so that he insists on getting her paid work at the Olive Branch, where she immediately runs into problems in the form of another employee named Catherine.
C and everything.
Spelled with a C, I know. Dark-haired troublemaker is a lot of us, apparently.
Catherine's a baddie.
Anyway, Mr. Dakin, again, is very approving of this and essentially tells Victoria that she can be a spy. He's paying her. They have like a communication thing set up if she finds anything interesting involving like a pink handkerchief.
Right. And I mean, I just have to say a note about this supposed global conspiracy thing that's been alluded to here. And it's alluded to throughout the book. I mean, starting with when we first meet Mr. Dakin and he's talking about these nefarious forces that want to somehow upend the summit. As in many of these Christie political thrillers, there's not a whole lot of specificity as to the conspiracy. It's very vague in the beginning of the book. And to give her credit, almost amusingly so, because it seems as though the grand master plan at the Olive Branch anyway is just to get people to get along better and interact more. And what's so funny is that it's, of course, a disaster. You can see Christie as kind of like the ultimate cynic, like the person who created Miss Marple and who had fairly individualist, conservative viewpoints about a lot of things. Like you can totally see her buying into that, not necessarily even in a bad way. I find it amusing. Just like, yes, well, the problem with wanting people to come together and make a better world is that people don't really like each other because people are kind of terrible. So that's not really a good plan. Mrs. Cardew Trench, I think, basically makes that joke. We came across that in 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe. The leftist idealists who want to create a new heaven and earth, all of these lofty ideals that they're trying to place on flawed humanity. I actually have no problem with that as a kind of vague global conspiracy.
Well, we're meant to believe even from the beginning that there is some international conspiracy that is both anti-capitalist and anti-communist. They're essentially the Joker, right? They want to just burn it down.
Chaos. Yeah, chaos. Mm-hmm.
So essentially, if you burn it down, you can start a new world order.
It's that sort of nihilism out of idealism, which I think she finds particularly frightening and insidious for good reason, right? And I think that there's a lot of paranoia around that sort of chaos creation, burn it all down viewpoint, particularly coming from young people that we saw even as early as the 40s, right? With 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe. I mean, that was in the early 40s. And we saw strains of it even with The Secret Adversary in the 20s. So it's not like this is because Christie's getting older. Like we've seen strains of this before. It's just that we see more of it in the thrillers because that's the main intrigue. In any case, meanwhile, saying that
so
word a lot.
So many meanwhiles, yeah.
So many meanwhiles. Sir Robert Crofton, our second victim, has been found murdered in Cairo after having left Baghdad. That's the sort of world-famous explorer and larger-than-life personality, very similar to Fakir Carmichael So that's not good. Time passes, as it tends to do, and Victoria really doesn't get much information at all from the olive branch, despite pretending to be a Marxist. I did find that amusing. She's pretending to read the Communist Manifesto and leaving it around the office, seeing if it sparks any conversation.
And Catherine notes, well, you'd have to actually be remotely intelligent for any of the Marxists to actually accept you. Catherine is a little bit Emily Blunt in The Devil Wears Prada.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have some prior commitment? Some hideous skirt convention you have to go to?
Catherine clearly hates Victoria. The feeling is mutual. And then worse, Dr. Rathbone, who, again, is Edward's boss and the head of this Olive Branch Society.
And a highly esteemed international intellectual.
Yeah, he himself seems to warn / perhaps even threaten Victoria about, whether or not she really belongs at the Olive Branch, and is she really comfortable here, and does this really make sense, and I could find you a better paying job elsewhere in the city. Maybe you shouldn't really be working here. But she plays dumb. At that point, she does at least get that he may be intimating something perhaps a little bit darker.
She has
out of here now.
She has some street smarts. I mean, that is like her talent.
She does. So on a day trip, Edward says that it would be more helpful if Victoria at least tried to be friendly to Catherine. So Victoria takes Catherine up on her offer to bring her to get her hair washed someplace professional and clean, because all that dust and sand out there. So once she gets there, Catherine leaves. Victoria starts to get her hair washed, and we know where this is going, people. Come on, we're in an Agatha Christie thriller. Honestly, it's surprising that no one has gotten chloroformed yet. And now Victoria gets chloroformed. Of course she does. That sickly sweet odor, we've been waiting for it. Here it is. And when she wakes up, she is no longer in Baghdad. She is in a locked room somewhere away from the city. She doesn't really understand why she's not dead. She's like, these people seem to want me dead, so I don't know why they haven't killed me. I will, by the way, identify this as, for me, the turning point of the novel as a reader. I found this sequence of events when she wakes up and has to effect her own escape to be engaging. And then the rest of the story moves pretty quickly. We've probably got like a third of the book left-ish.
Yeah, like that. Probably. We're in the third act.
Yeah. So she's in a locked room, but the key is in the lock on the other side and no one is watching her cell. And then she happens upon the ingenious solution of spilling water on the dirt floor directly under her door so that it becomes muddy, and she can dig out a space big enough to put her arm underneath the door and pick up the key, which she has knocked out of the lock on the other side.
And I do have to say, I appreciated her ingenuity, and she uses the insole of her shoe to cram through the keyhole.
And she also doesn't leave right away. It's not like she just goes running out of the cell screaming. She waits until it gets dark. She sneaks away. And then she walks several miles into the desert. She decides that her only option is to wait for a car and hope that it's a car of good people rather than bad people. She also ends up finding a little hill, right? And she has no idea what this hill is, but she shelters behind it because when a car is coming, she can at least sort of hide. So wait and see maybe who it is. And eventually a car does come up, doesn't it, Catherine?
Yes. An Englishman gets out to examine the ground. And he very intensely is studying the ground. And it's Richard Baker, who we met with earlier. So she runs at him and he's a little taken aback. And then she immediately tells him the true story of the kidnapping. But of course, he doesn't believe her, but he agrees to take her with him to his destination because he's not going to leave this clearly disturbed person wandering around in the desert by herself. So it's the archaeological dig of Dr. Poncefoot Jones, who, she's been saying this entire time is her uncle. And, she's a little concerned about this, but it turns out that the good doctor is real spacey. And so he takes it for granted that she's the Veronica / Victoria / somebody who his friend Emerson has put him in touch with, and they're expecting her for the summer for anthropology purposes. Even though they don't really need an anthropologist, they're doing it as a favor. Victoria, being a good mimic and liar, just runs with it. Because she figures she'll be safe there. Nobody knows that she's there, right? So, she settles in. She plays tour guide to guests, including 2 Frenchmen, one of whom appears to ransack Baker's rooms while he's feigning an illness. We should also note, at this dig, when she first gets there, Victoria, is given stuff to bathe with, and she catches a glimpse of herself, and she's platinum blonde versus her normal black hair. The kidnappers bleached her hair, and she just finds out when she sees herself in the camp. And I do have to say, Kemper, as somebody who has bleached her hair platinum blonde, she would know. It feels like your scalp is on fire.
Not the first time that Christie has strained credibility with the bleaching of hair, lest we forget the body in the library. So Victoria's super bored, and she's reading all the books that they have around, which are mostly archaeology books. But there are a few classic novels, including, wait for it, we know that Agatha Christie loves her Dickens. And in this very book, there actually are multiple references to Mr. Micawber from David Copperfield. We get a reference to Mrs. Harris from Martin Chuzzlewit, which had also been referenced in Murder on the Orient Express. But we have a much more important Dickens reference here from the Dickens-loving Agatha Christie, A Tale of Two Cities. Victoria is reading it, and that novel, of course, features a character called Madame Defarge, not Lafarge, which would be one of those cryptic words that Carmichael spoke, but Defarge is pretty close. Madame Defarge is one of the villains of A Tale of Two Cities. She is rather aggressive, we could say, head of a tricoteuse, which is a bunch of knitting women, and she's a fanatical member of the French Revolution, and she actually knits code into whatever skein of fabric she's working on.
Well, we should note that also the tricoteuses were real.
Yeah. So Victoria realizes that she must not have heard Carmichael say Lafarge, but Defarge, and that this was a reference to some sort of code knitted into that red scarf he was wearing, which Victoria still has. She just stuffed it in and among her things, and she didn't think that there was anything significant about it. So she explains all this to Richard Baker, who at this point, he's apparently listening to her and doesn't think she's totally crazy, or is at least just intrigued, and he agrees to take her back to Baghdad. I have to say, I am proud of myself for picking up on the Dickens Tale of Two Cities reference with the name of Lafarge, but I was too lazy to actually go to A Tale of Two Cities like on Wikipedia and look it up, because I thought that was the actual name. So I misremembered, just like Victoria Jones did, because I was like, oh right, Madame Lafarge, the one who knits.
Right.
And I didn't even realize that it was Defarge and not Lafarge. So that clue really worked for me, if we want to call it a clue.
Anywhoosies, they go to Baghdad, and of course she seeks out Edward, who has been frightfully worried about her. So they go on a car ride picnic, during which he mentions something about her made-up story about her uncle, the bishop. So if we remember this from earlier, her two uncles were Dr. Ponsford Jones and then this bishop. Except she only told that story to the Clips when she was interviewing for the job, but she didn't tell Edward. She never mentioned the story to Edward. So how does he know? Where did he hear it? Do we all of a sudden get a bad feeling, Kemper?
We certainly do. And I think this is the turning point from the world as it appears to be to the world as it actually is, because dun dun dun, Edward is a baddie. He is
very bad. He's Lucifer.
He's got the face of an angel, but he is very, very bad. And it is in this moment, which is an effective scene in the book.
Oh, yeah, it works
when
well.
Victoria is sitting with Edward. Here's what Christie writes. As she looked at that beautiful, evil face, all her silly adolescent calf love faded away, and she knew that what she felt for Edward had never been love. It had been the same feeling that she had experienced some years earlier for Humphrey Bogart, and later for the Duke of Edinburgh. It had been glamour, and Edward had never loved her. He had exerted his charm and glamour deliberately. He had picked her up that day, using his charm so easily, so naturally, that she had fallen for it without a struggle. She had been a sucker. Of course, glamour and charm are euphemisms for sex appeal. This is a story about a woman who fell in lust with a man and traveled halfway around the world pursuing him. I think that's interesting and unusual. And there is a lot of ink spilled as to how beautiful Edward is. His beautiful face, his beautiful neck, just his overall charm, the way that all the other women at the Olive Branch are obsessed with him. Mm-hmm. He attracts all these women because he is super hot. That's what he very deliberately was doing with Victoria, and the pretense falls away in this moment, though Victoria, since again, maybe she doesn't have the deepest, most wrinkly cerebral cortex, but her medulla oblongata is functioning quite well. So she's got really good reflexes. That lizard brain is humming along, and she adjusts to her situation. She puts on her acting cap, and she adoringly tells Edward that, oh my God, I can't believe it. So you knew before, so you must be at the center of all this, and you love me so much that you arranged for me to come to Baghdad. This whole thing was meant for me, and oh my gosh, I'm a luckier girl in the world than I even thought before. And Edward begins to simper. He may be evil, but evil has its weaknesses too, one of them being vanity. And he starts talking about how this is the new order, and of course the clips work for him, and Catherine, and dozens of other people around Baghdad and through the West. And yes, he is a genius, and he has masterminded this whole thing. And Victoria can see it in his eyes now. He cares nothing about her, and he thinks still that she's a fool and that he can manipulate her in this moment. And she realizes that he needs to keep thinking that, otherwise she will be dead very soon. Right. So, it's terrifying and it's well done.
Yeah, that entire scene is one of the best done sequences in the book.
So what is the plot here?
You see, Victoria looks a lot like Anna Shiel, like a lot like her. They have different hair colors. Victoria's dark. Anna Shiel is noted at the very beginning of the book that she has platinum hair, even though she's not glamorous. Her hair is platinum. And she turns out to be the thorn in this New Order's side, as were Carmichael and Sir Robert Crofton, because they all have information about what this giant grand international conspiracy is. And so this New Order, run by Edward, has to get rid of Anna Shiel, just like they did with Sir Robert, because Victoria's been right about one thing. The Sir Robert at the T.O. Hotel was not the same Sir Robert on the plane, because the hotel version did not have a giant boil on the back of his neck. So what actually happened here is that Sir Robert had been captured during the stopover in Cairo on the plane, and he'd been swapped out for someone wearing his clothes and who looked almost identical. And because Sir Robert is a sort of over-the-top personality with like a giant mustache, dashing clothes, etc., he just was swapped out. And they are planning to do the same thing to Anna Shiel when she arrives in Syria, because they have been tracking people coming into the region. And the only possibility that they have is a woman named Greta Harden, who's Danish, who doesn't exist. They've done the background checks on all these people flying in, and the only one that doesn't make sense is this Greta Harden, and it has to be Anna.
Right. Greta has to be Anna Shiel, with an alias.
Mm-hmm.
So Victoria has no choice but to go along with this plan. This is her only use. So they dress her as a nun, because of course they do. And they go to Damascus, where Greta Harden is, yes, chloroformed and held. And Victoria puts on this Greta Harden's clothes, and she goes back to Baghdad. And she's pretty desperate to get a message to Dakin at this point, of course, who she knows is on the side of good here. But she's never left alone. And even worse, one of the other women on the plane is Mrs. Pauncefort Jones. That would be the archaeology leader's wife. It had been mentioned that she was coming to visit her husband shortly. Victoria desperately wants to alert her to get a message to Richard Baker, who's obviously with Dr. Pauncefort Jones, but she can't. She's just stuck here because she's under constant surveillance. So she's brought to another hotel, and she's held there with Catherine, keeping guard. Ugh, Catherine. And they have fake papers here, because the idea is that Victoria, posing as now Anna Shiel, is going to present these papers at the conference and say, here is the evidence that all of these horrible things are going on, and that no one here should be trusting anyone else.
Right, except she doesn't even have to present the papers, because she will have laryngitis. That's why she's brought and held in the hotel room. So all she has to do is be there, be seen. And
so then the papers will be submitted and read, right?
Meanwhile, because we haven't used that word enough, Richard Baker is very anxious. He's back at the dig site, and he's very anxious about where Victoria disappeared to, because she didn't go back with them. She just vanished in Baghdad. So he goes back to Baghdad, and he also finds out that Mrs. Pauncefort Jones is arriving earlier than expected from London. So he decides to wait for her to go back to the dig site. And then he also seeks out Mr. Dakin, where he essentially admits everything to him and shows him that original chit from Carmichael's pocket that he's been keeping safe.
And it's obvious that that original chit that Carmichael had given to Richard Baker, it obviously has something critical on it to Dakin.
Right.
When he finally receives it now from Richard Baker. So in the other hotel, Catherine gets tied up by a henchman because the idea is that she'll say that someone came in and they tied her up and then oopsie, they killed Victoria. So Victoria knows that her death here is imminent because her presence was all that was required for submitting these papers, and she is about to be very, very useless to these bad people. But just as that is about to happen, the hotel room is in fact broken into and Victoria is knocked down. And then we flash forward and we find that Victoria is fine. Dakin has that scarf, which had been among Victoria's things. Catherine and her colleagues are captured, and the conference is continuing in a much more constructive fashion than those evil conspirators spearheaded by Edward ever meant it to go on.
What's happening here, Kemper? Well, to the best of our ability to explain, at the conference, we find out that the evidence that Carmichael had was of, again, this new order, which appears to have been hoarding money. So money has essentially been disappearing from circulation, and then it's being laundered through jewels, etc. And also there's a hint that maybe there's uranium in rural China where nobody's looking for these people, and that they know that this is a plot to pit the capitalists and the communists against each other even more than I suppose they already are. And again, to establish this sort of blank slate. Carmichael had this documented on microfiche, which has been missing, and he couldn't tell them the location before being murdered by the fake Sir Robert Crofton. And so the scarf had knitted into it a list of names of Carmichael's most trusted friends. And then that chip that he gave to Richard, when exposed to chemicals, reveals the code words necessary to gain access to those friends. So essentially, both Victoria and Richard have one half of the puzzle, and put together, you end up finding somebody like the Sheikh Hussein al-Zaira, who had the microfiche. And
we've never heard his name before, have we?
Nope, he just shows up right here. We should also note that when Richard picked up Mrs. Ponsfoot-Jones from the airport, it turns out that Elsie Ponsfoot-Jones had a maiden name. She was Elsie Shiel. Elsie Shiel is still recuperating in England. Mrs. Ponsfoot-Jones was her sister, Anna Shiel, who entered the country on her sister's papers. Greta Harden was a decoy spy placed on the plane to deliberately attract this new order's attention. And so when earlier we mentioned that Richard goes to see Mr. Dakin, he has with him Anna Shiel.
I would like to point out that Anna Shiel is said to have this great financial brain, and she reminded me in that description of Letitia Blacklock from A Murder is Announced. And here we have two sisters and one pretending to be the other. And that is the only commonality I can find between this book and The Wonder that is A Murder is Announced that Christie wrote right before this one. So I'm really trying here, folks, but we do have that. Yeah, so the plot has been exposed, even though it's really explained to us after the fact, and we're never given clues or wherewithal to figure any of this out until we're just spoon-fed it at the very end. But all's well that ends well. Or at least just ends. Richard Baker offers Victoria that job as the anthropologist at the archaeological dig, since the real Veronica or Venetia or whatever her name was apparently came down with the mumps and she couldn't make it. And let's just put it out here in the open, folks. Obviously, Richard Baker is in love with Victoria Jones. Victoria and Richard will live happily ever after. She gets her archaeologist. The end. Before we get into rankings, we should very briefly note, this book is often cited as one of the few Christies that doesn't have an adaptation. That is not entirely true. There is no major film adaptation for this book, but there is actually a television adaptation in existence, and we were lucky enough to watch it. It aired on the 12th of May in 1952, so very soon.
Yeah, a year later.
After this book came out.
And it's American, we should note.
It's part of the Westinghouse Studio One, which aired live on CBS. As we always do, we turn to our good friend Mark Aldridge about anything having to do with Christie adaptations, and this is a really odd one to be adapted because Mark even notes that one of the reasons why Christie stories were so often used in early television was that they had tight plotting, a small cast of characters, very few locations. None of that is true before they came to Baghdad. There's a ton of people, the plotting is very loose, and there's locations galore. So it's actually a quite tricky, if not expensive thing to film. That being said, they chose to do it, and we would have to think, and this is something that Mark theorizes in his book, that it is an indication that the interest for broadcasters has started to move towards Agatha Christie as a name known to the general audience, with the hope that viewers would recognize this recent publication and therefore be interested in seeing it on screen, rather than taking advantage of her particular storytelling formulae. So I think you could almost see this adaptation as a bit of a turning point in terms of Christie the brand.
Agatha Christie is IP.
Yeah, the fact that it was a Christie story was what attracted the television producers, not the story itself.
And it's also it's not a Marple or a Poirot, so they could get the rights to it.
Exactly. The TV adaptation is interesting. I mean, it's only an hour, so there's a lot of condensing that happens. One of the biggest changes is that we know from the get-go that Edward is a villain. So there's a bit of dramatic irony there. The audience knows it, but Victoria doesn't. Whereas in the book, we learn with Victoria, and that simplifies matters considerably. It's a serviceable adaptation. I did find Victoria Jones's voice to be grating beyond belief.
Do you suppose you could lend me threepence?
Well,
My name is Victoria Jones, and it's truly to be alone. You see, I've just had the most frightful experience. I popped into Selfridges to buy a new hat, and like a fool, I left my checkbook in my flat. And the hat was a guinea, and all I had was £1. And I liked this hat, and they were so nice about the extra shilling that I just had to buy it. And now I haven't a sou, and I just must phone for my chauffeur.
They were going for something cutesy with Victoria in this adaptation, and it just does not work for me.
Right. I mean, but also, aren't they going for something cutesy with Victoria in the book?
Yeah, no, it's not. My beef doesn't even really lie with the producers. I think that they absolutely were trying to bring her to life from the page, and hearing her was just another layer of frustration.
Do you know that they've re-optioned the rights again for this? Like last year.
Yes, there is a potentially new version in the works. I don't have any details on it. It looks like Entertainment One, I believe, is the studio that optioned the rights. Talk about Christie as a brand. People are desperate to adapt any Christie, right? So this is one of those outlier titles, outlier for a reason, but it's still a Christie novel. So it doesn't really surprise me that someone is interested in 2019 in adapting it. And you could obviously do a very splashy, big budget version of this, similar to what's probably going to happen with Death Comes as the End, which we'll see very shortly. That's another one that hadn't really been adapted in a major way. I did find it really amusing that the biggest gaps in production happened, ironically, in the pre-Baghdad sections of the story, because this is an American television production pretending to be in London, and Victoria's coworker has literally the worst English accent I've ever heard.
You know, I wish you hadn't got the sack, Miss Jones. I'm going to miss you and your fanciful tales. What really happened?
There's also like a newspaper headline that shoots out on screen, and it says, Mr. Churchill warns labor, and it's labor spelled Labor.
But it was never going to be shown in the UK, right?
Sure. It's just funny. I didn't even notice that, by the way. Mark is the one who pointed that out. I'm going to be honest, and this is probably a good segue into the rankings. This is not one of those novels where I feel all that badly about the fact that there is not an adaptation that does the book justice, because this is just not my favorite Christie. All right, we'll start with plot mechanics and plot credibility, as we always do. I would like to quote from the reader report that was submitted to Collins when Christie submitted the manuscript to her publisher. Difficult to believe that Mrs. Christie regards this as more than a joke. Plot in many of the situations far-fetched and puerile to a degree. However, and this is something that John Curran points out also when he talks about how eminently readable Christie is and how that is a quality that is so often unappreciated, that same reader said, it is eminently readable and passes the acid test of holding the interest throughout. And I do agree. I mean, I think it just passes that very low bar of being readable.
We've talked about this off mic, Kemper, but it took me like 4 times to start this book. And every single time I was like, oh, I'm sorry. No, just no. You know, I made myself read it in a single sitting. And if you do that, it actually gets much easier to read. But for me, it was that the entry barrier to it was really high.
Yeah, and like I said, I think it gets zippier in its second half. So the setup is painful.
Well, it's tedious and it doesn't make a lot of sense.
I totally agree. We mentioned this actually on our interview episode with Sophie Hannah, that Death Comes at the End was the only book at the time I was reading it that, were it not for this podcast, I wouldn't have finished it when I was rereading it. That is definitely the case for this book. I think it's even more damning than in the case of Death Comes at the End that I didn't want to finish this, because I know that I had read Death Comes at the End when I was younger. I'm fairly certain I actually never read this book before.
Yeah, so I don't think I did either.
Because it's such an outlier and it's not one that fans talk about that much, because I don't think it's many people's favorite. So this was a fresh read and I still didn't want to finish it, which is shocking.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you're totally right that if you get to like the midpoint of it, it's pretty quick from there.
Yeah. It's the setup and all of the different pieces that seem to have nothing to do with each other, and nothing is happening, and it's confusing and it's boring. We almost never say that about Christie. Christie can be many things, but she is almost never boring.
Almost never.
This is an exception. I have two notes when I was researching this book for the episode that I did find delightful, so I would just like to punctuate this rather dreary conversation with them of what could have been. Apparently, this is, of course, per John Curran, because interestingly, this is one of the longest sections within Agatha Christie's notebooks. This book takes up 100 pages. It's one of her most expansive note sections for any title. And apparently, she kept on sketching out the opening chapters again and again and again, as though they perhaps weren't working. And she kept on trying to make them fit. So, not shocking that they didn't seem to really work that well. She really seemed to struggle with them. So that said, though, I was delighted by the fact that John Curran reported that at one point Christie was seriously considering making this a Tommy and Tuppence novel.
Which would have made more sense.
Oh my God. The parallels between Victoria and Tuppence are obvious. She's one of these pert thriller heroines, and I would argue that Tuppence is the best version of any of those heroines, bar potentially Anne Bedingfeld.
But Tuppence is extremely bright.
She is, of course. But I actually think Victoria's brightness is similar to Tommy's, right?
Right.
It's that lizard brain.
Much closer to Tommy, yes.
Yeah, it's like she's marrying the intelligence of Tommy with the pert hijinks of Tuppence.
Yeah.
So it's almost like taking the worst of Tommy and Tuppence and channeling it into one person, versus if it had just been Tommy and Tuppence, I would have been thrilled. And also, because this is the second fun fact, she was apparently thinking about inserting, wait for it, Ariadne Oliver into this book, along with an erudite brother of hers who is meant to be very learned and horrified by her commercial fiction. That sounds super fun too. Like, she clearly was toying, like she knew something was missing, something wasn't working. She kept on writing it over and over again. She devoted all of these pages in her notebook to it. It just didn't quite come together. That's how it feels to me as a reader.
Right, and trying to get any sort of grip on like what they're doing in, the interior of China, like all of that stuff, none of it's explained ever. And we said this up front, we don't know who killed the two victims, actually.
No, it was just shadowy actors in this conspiracy. Here's also, I think, the damning evidence as to why plot credibility so specifically is bad in this book, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about just now goes to plot mechanics. I'm just going to say it. I think this is one of her worst books, plot mechanics wise. So I'm very low on plot mechanics, and I'm actually really low on plot credibility too. And John Curran puts it best, so I'm just going to quote him, as I do so often here. Because there's a huge plot hole in this book which falls to credibility, and this is what he says. It must be asked why Edward in chapter 2 should draw attention to, quote, something fishy, end quote, in the Baghdad setup, thereby setting the whole novel in motion, when he is the very surprising villain of the piece. He could easily have invented another reason to persuade Victoria to follow him. This very basic flaw in the plot is possibly a reflection of the problems the book seems to have given in its creation.
Yeah, I guess I assumed that he is a narcissist who thought that throwing suspicion towards Dr. Rathbone would be sufficient, because clearly he thinks Victoria's a dum-dum too.
That's the problem, though. He's a dum-dum too. They're all dum-dums.
Right.
I don't believe any of it.
No, and all the smart people, the Mr. Dakins and the Anna Shields aren't in the book, really.
Yeah, they're just at the edges of the book. They're not actually in the book. I'll tell you where I come out on plot mechanics and plot credibility. I would give them both a 3.
Yeah. I would put mechanics above credibility, but I can be sold on that.
Okay. So then we get to characters, and this is one category since we obviously don't have any series long characters. I will just note this. I have a fun fact in this category as well to break up the pain. This is one of Christie's only books to feature a real person as a character. So the bartender at the Hotel Tio, I, of course, read his name as Jesus. I think we're actually supposed to just pronounce it Jesus.
Well, I think so too, because Victoria is very
joke,
surprised.
Right?
Yeah, it's a joke.
Yeah, that's my California
right.
influence showing there, that I would automatically say Jesus. That's my default. But yeah, so Jesus was an actual bartender at the Hotel Zia, which was a very real hotel in Baghdad that Christie was very familiar with. And it's very obviously the Hotel Tio. So that's a real hotel. That's fun, but that doesn't really have anything to do with characters. I just thought that was fun. I think we've kind of talked about this. I just loathed Victoria as a character. I think that comparing Fakir Carmichael to Lawrence of Arabia says everything you need to know about how glancing and slight of a character he is compared to the man who inspired that character. Apparently, per Janet Morgan, the character of Sir Rupert Crofton Lee, with, quote, curling gray hair growing down over a muscular red-brown neck, had a strong suggestion of Max's archaeological colleague, Mortimer Wheeler. Cool. On that note, Richard Baker feels very much like a stand-in for Max Mallowan, of course. I mean, he's the archaeologist who ultimately gets the girl. And that might be one of the most charming things in this book. And I think one of the more interesting points that I feel like I can make about this book is comparing it with The Man in the Brown Suit, which Agatha Christie wrote when she was still married to her first husband, Archie Christie. And we've talked a lot about how that book is a bit of wish fulfillment, and Anne Bedingfeld ends up with the dangerous man and the dashing man, and they live in wedded bliss, and it's all just very passionate. Things have changed here. This is an older and more mature and perhaps wiser Christie writing from the vantage point of her second marriage. And this might actually be what I'm going to call the greatest subtweet of Archie Christie in any of Christie's books. It comes from Victoria at the end of the novel when she has learned the error of her ways with Edward. And this is what she says. "Next time I fall in love," said Victoria, "it won't be looks that attract me, or glamour. I'd like a real man, not one who says pretty things to you. I shan't mind if he's bald or wears spectacles or anything like that. I'd like him to be interesting and know about interesting things." Burn.
Real burn. Also, there's a line earlier about how Richard Baker is not married, and about how that's ridiculous because archaeologists make very fine husbands.
Yes, totally. Although this is always a good time to point out, and I believe we've mentioned this before on the podcast, Agatha Christie never made that apocryphal joke. Archaeologists are the best husbands because the older you get, the more they appreciate you. She was actually very sensitive to the difference in age.
Right.
Yeah, between her and Max Mallowan. She never said that. It was not a joke she ever would have made. But yes, I thought that was charming.
The most interesting character in this book has the least amount of page time, because the most interesting character is Anna Shiel.
I don't even know if you could call her interesting because she's so little of a character. She's intriguing.
Yeah, she's intriguing. That would be a more interesting story. And also, Mr. Dakin is the George Smiley of this novel, right? It's very clear that his job as a mid-level bureaucrat in an oil company is cover for him being like MI6.
Yeah, and he's actually an incredibly powerful
spy master.
Super spy. Yeah. I also had identified Anna Shiel as really intriguing. I liked her a lot, and I was amused by Dr. Pauncefort Jones, but there's just not a lot in here. I mean, being kind, I think we could maybe give it a 5. I don't think it deserves any more than that. We should probably give it a 4. But
I was really wavering between those two numbers. Yeah, just by virtue of the fact that we're going to have to double it, I guess we can give it a 5.
Right. A 4 seems a little aggressive. So 5 and 5 for characters. And then we get to setting and tone. I always like to give credit where it's due, and we haven't been able to give much credit yet for this novel. In terms of the macro setting of this being post-war, that's something that we've talked about in every single one of Christie's books post-World War II. I actually think this is kind of the bad version of that, because we get that kind of paranoia and sense of dislocation and dismayed confusion when it comes to this vague plot. So I didn't love that, but in terms of the micro setting, with this obviously being set in Baghdad, which is a city, and Basra, cities that Christie knew very well, you can feel that. And there's a specificity to the descriptions of these cities. Here's Henry Carmichael approaching the city of Basra. The boat turned gently into the waterway that ran at right angles to the river. Here, all kinds of rivercraft were tied up, and other boats were coming in before and after them. It was a lovely, almost Venetian scene. The boats with their high-scrolled prows and the soft, faded colors of their paintwork. There were hundreds of them tied up close alongside each other. And then he disembarks, and she writes, all about him were the usual waterside figures, small boys, orange sellers squatting down by their trays of merchandise, sticky squares of cakes and sweetmeats, trays of bootlaces and cheap combs and pieces of elastic, contemplative strollers spitting raucously from time to time, wandering along with their beads clicking in their hands. On the opposite side of the street where the shops were and the banks, busy young effendis walked briskly in European suits of a slightly purplish tinge. Very well done.
Yeah, I agree.
Clearly, she saw all of that, and I can imagine her walking along, a market and hearing someone clicking their beads and then thinking, ooh, imagine if someone were sitting in an office and they started clicking those beads as Morse code. That would be interesting. That's cool. There was potentially a version of this novel that could have been really charming and entertaining along the lines of The Man in the Brown Suit. This one just never got there.
I think, unfortunately, for this category, we do combine setting and tone, and I think the tone is bad.
Yeah, a 6?
Yeah, that's where I was landing.
And, in that this has become the catch-all category, and we talk a little bit about readability and enjoyment of the reading experience and writing style. This is just one where she's getting low marks for all of that here.
Yeah.
So I think a 6 is as high as we can go. And then our final category, Stuck in Its Time, I'm going to argue for one deduction. I think that Victoria's impersonation of her boss, Mr. Greenholtz, his wife, is anti-Semitic. This is how she impersonates her. Why do you say we not have that Noel settee, Daddy? She demanded in a high, whining voice. Mrs. D.F. Takis, she have one in electric blue satin. You say it is money that is tight, but then why you take that blonde girl out dining and dancing? You think I do not know, etc., etc.
It might not read it as that. I read it as a class.
But the English is broken a little bit.
Yeah, it is broken.
And here's the thing. Maybe it's not anti-Semitism per se, but there's not a whole lot of good stuff going on in that impersonation. I think there's some xenophobia, classist, something or other happening, but I have more, because we also do get a reference to Jewesses within a laundry list of nationalities, which is jarring. That's just one little bump. But then when Victoria goes to that agency to try to procure another job, when she's been fired and she's trying to figure out Baghdad and how to get to Baghdad and all of that, she implies that Mr. Greenholtz was inappropriate with her. This is another example of Christie playing it for comedy. We are supposed to find this hilarious. Dear me, Miss Jones, not out of a post again. I really hoped this last one. Quite impossible, said Victoria firmly. I really couldn't begin to tell you what I had to put up with. A pleasurable flush rose in Miss Spencer's pallid cheek. Not, she began. I do hope not. He didn't seem to me really that sort of man, but of course he is a trifle gross. I do hope... It's quite all right, said Victoria. She conjured up a pale, brave smile. I can take care of myself. Oh, of course, but it's the unpleasantness. Yes, said Victoria, it is unpleasant. However, she smiled bravely again. He's clearly a philanderer. I guess maybe you could, if you really want to give her the benefit of the doubt, maybe he actually has tried something on her. It's just, it doesn't read that way. But then we also get Richard Baker, who's supposed to be, in that he ends up with Victoria. He's like our hero of sorts. When he's just met her, this is what he says about her to Dr. Ponsford-Jones. She must be one of those hysterical girls who say curates are in love with them or that doctors assault them. She may give us a lot of trouble.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's upsetting, especially in 2019, because you want to be able to say, listen to all women when they come to you with something. And then you get somebody like her who's essentially undermining that by lying. And that is obviously a real problem.
This is the definition of stuck in its time, because this is being read in a very specific time for us. Like, this probably says more about the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it says more about us reading it than it does about the book, frankly.
But that's what stuck in its time means also, to a certain extent. How is it perceived by someone who's reading it right now?
It almost made her feel more modern, because it almost felt like this is 2019, the year of the scammer. And it really feels like, a New York Magazine profile could be written about Victoria Jones and her scamming techniques.
Right. Fair enough. You know what? I'm persuaded. We can do 0. That's fine.
I just don't think that they're egregious, especially in a book that's filled with a bunch of Middle Eastern characters where this could have gone very poorly.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that comes from the fact that she actually lived there, not year round, but she was a frequent traveler to the place and she was writing what she knew. And I think there's not a lot of stereotyping that, you know, someone who was less familiar with the area would have done. It feels confidently written. I'm convinced. I'm always happy to do fewer rather than more of those anyway. So let's tally this up. We've got a 3 plus 3 plus 5 plus 5 plus 6 minus 0 for a grand total of 22 points, putting They Came to Baghdad in a tie with Murder is Easy. I think I know which one you are going to want to put ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, Murder is Easy.
Of course. Murder is Easy should 100% be above They Came to Baghdad. Right now, this is our 6th lowest title. I'm just going to go ahead and read out our bottom 10 at this point for our 41 titles. We've got Dumb Witness, followed by The Murder on the Links, followed by The Mystery of the Blue Train, Murder is Easy, They Came to Baghdad, Why Didn't They Ask Evans, The Seven Dials Mystery, Death Comes as the End, The Big Four, and The Secret of Chimneys. If anything, I think that this perhaps should be a little bit lower.
Yeah, I agree.
We may be adding that deduction yet. No, actually, I don't think we need to add a deduction. I think we can lower some of those other categories because other than plot mechanics and plot credibility, I think we were being kind and we could certainly go lower. But it's in the right zone because it's in the bottom and a lot of those thrillers tend to be in the bottom, not because we hate all thrillers. Let's remind listeners that The Man in the Brown Suit is sitting pretty at number 25 and The Secret Adversary right above it at number 24. You know, we love a thriller that's well done. This just unfortunately was not one of them. Next, we will be covering The Call of Wings, an early Agatha Christie short story that has a little bit of a holiday theme to it. We thought that this would be a good time to cover it in this holiday season. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you about this novel or anything else that we're covering. You can always find us on our Patreon site at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can reach Catherine at Brobcat, and our Instagram handle is at allaboutagatha. And please take a moment to rate and review us, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.